It was an ordinary school day, or so it seemed at first. The bell rang, signaling the start of a new class, and students rushed to their seats. Among them was a quiet boy, just trying to get through the day like everyone else. But today, something was different. Today, something would happen that would shake the very foundation of the school, and no one could have predicted what it would lead to. This young boy, with bright eyes full of potential, sat at his desk, trying to focus on the lesson. He had always been a good student, quiet, respectful, and always trying his best. But there was something unique about him that set him apart from the other kids, something that, for reasons beyond his control, drew unwanted attention from some of his peers, and even, tragically, his teacher. Today, his world was about to collide with something much bigger than him, something he never could have seen coming. The teacher, an older woman with a history of discipline issues, had her own prejudices. She didn't understand the culture of the students she was teaching. She didn't understand why this boy's hair was different, why it stood out in a crowd. In her mind, it was just something that needed to be fixed, a little correction here and there. But today, she would take things too far. Today, she would make a choice that would change everything. Without thinking twice, she pulled out a bottle of super glue, a seemingly innocent object that would soon become the source of a growing controversy. The boy, caught off guard, felt the cold, sticky substance slowly being poured into his hair. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know why this was happening. All he could do was sit there in shock, his mind racing. Was this some kind of punishment? A joke? But nothing about this felt right. As the glue started to set, his heart began to race. What was going on? Why was his teacher doing this to him? The boy tried to speak up, to ask for help, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to make a scene, but inside, he felt something shifting. A deep, unsettling feeling that he couldn't shake. What neither the teacher nor the boy realized in that moment was that there was someone else in the school who would soon find out about this. Someone who, when they heard what had happened, would set the entire school into motion. This person wasn't just any ordinary person. This person had power, influence, and connections. This person wasn't just a parent. They were the principal of the school. The boy's father, the principal, had always been a figure of authority and respect. He had worked tirelessly to ensure the school ran smoothly, to create an environment where every student felt safe and valued. But what the teacher didn't know was that her actions were about to ignite something far beyond what she could ever have imagined. When the principal learned about what had happened to his son, there would be no going back. It was only after the bell rang for lunch, and the boy walked out of his classroom, his hands trembling, that he realized something was very, very wrong. He tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that everything was fine. But the sticky weight in his hair and the cold, horrified stares from his classmates made it impossible to forget. They saw what had happened. They knew what had been done to him. And word started to spread. The boy's mind raced as he made his way to the principal's office. Would his father be able to help? Would he understand what had happened? Would he even believe him? He could hear his father's voice in his head. "You can always come to me if you need help." But would his father truly understand the depth of what had happened? Would he believe that his own son had been treated like this, right under his nose? As the boy slowly approached the door to his father's office, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that everything was about to change. The power dynamics of the school, the trust between student and teacher, the delicate balance that kept everything running smoothly. It was all about to unravel. And it would all start with one question. How would the principal respond when he found out what had happened to his son? The tension in the air was thick as the boy raised his hand to knock on the door. He could hear his father's voice from the other side, deep in conversation. But just before he could knock, the door swung open. His father stood there, his expression unreadable. He looked down at his son, and then at his son's hair, his eyes narrowing with understanding. The silence between them was deafening. Before either of them could speak, the boy's voice broke the stillness. Dad, something happened. What happened next would send shockwaves through the school, setting off a chain of events no one could have expected. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge everything about fairness, power, and what it means to stand up for what's right. But there was one thing everyone was about to learn the hard way. In this school, when you mess with the wrong kid, you might just be messing with the wrong family. And now, with the truth beginning to unfold, the question remained: how would the teacher, the principal, and the entire school react to what was coming next? Would the teacher face the consequences of her actions, or would this be swept under the rug? The clock was ticking, and time was running out. The boy was about to find out that things don't always stay quiet for long. And in this story, justice was about to take center stage. The boy's father, the principal, stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of his son's face. There was a slight tremble in his son's hands, and his eyes were wide with uncertainty. The thick, sticky residue in his son's hair caught the principal's attention almost immediately. He took a sharp breath, trying to remain calm as he kneeled down to meet his son's gaze. "What's going on, son?" the principal asked quietly, his voice low and steady, but the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. The boy struggled to find the right words. His throat felt dry, and his chest tightened as he tried to explain. "It was the teacher, Dad. She did this to me." His voice was shaky, but there was a hint of anger beginning to form behind his words. The principal's eyes flickered with disbelief, then narrowed as he tried to make sense of what his son was saying. "What do you mean? What teacher?" "Ms. Lawson," the boy replied, his voice growing more firm. "She poured super glue in my hair. I don't know why. She just did it." The principal's face hardened, his mind racing. Ms. Lawson had been at the school for years. She had always seemed a bit distant, a bit harsh with the students, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The idea that she would treat his son like this, his son, the very boy she knew was the principal's child, was almost unthinkable. Without another word, the principal stood up abruptly and walked toward his office. "Stay here. I need to make a call," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't want to make a scene yet, but everything inside him was telling him this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The weight of his role as the head of the school settled heavily on his shoulders as he opened his office door. He shut it behind him with a soft click, and in that moment, the tension in the air seemed to grow even thicker. He pulled out his phone, his hands suddenly feeling clammy. As he dialed the number for the school counselor, he glanced back at the door, half expecting to see his son standing there, waiting for him to return. But the boy had stayed in the hallway, as instructed, likely afraid of making too much noise, too much of a spectacle. The principal's heart ached at the thought. His son deserved better. The phone rang twice before the counselor picked up. "Principal, how can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. "This is urgent," he said, his voice betraying his growing unease. "I need you to get Ms. Lawson and meet me in my office right now. It's about my son." The counselor hesitated for just a second before responding. "Is everything okay, sir?" "No," he said firmly. "It's far from okay. Just get her here. Now." With the phone call over, the principal rubbed his temples, his mind racing. How had this happened? Ms. Lawson was well-liked by most of the staff. She had a reputation for being strict, yes, but nothing to suggest she would ever cross such a line. He had heard rumors, of course. Every school had its whispers, but never anything this severe. Back in the hallway, the boy stood still, his body tense as he tried to control his breathing. He hadn't expected his father to react so strongly. He had hoped for comfort, for understanding. But instead, the look on his father's face had shown something else. Something he didn't quite understand yet, but something powerful. He was afraid too, but for different reasons. What if no one believed him? What if the teacher had an explanation for everything? What if she said he had done something to deserve this, something he didn't even remember? He had been thinking about the glue in his hair all morning, trying to understand why it was happening, why this teacher had singled him out. Had it been a mistake, or had it been on purpose? As his mind raced with the possibilities, his father walked back into the hallway, his face still unreadable. He reached out and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the weight of his touch reassuring, but heavy with the weight of the situation. "We'll get this sorted," he said, his voice softer now. "But I need you to stay calm. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. It wasn't just the glue that was bothering him now. It was everything. Why had Ms. Lawson done this to him? Had he said something to her? Had he looked at her wrong? The questions were endless, and he had no answers. The door to the principal's office creaked open, and in walked Ms. Lawson, flanked by the counselor. She had a stern look on her face, but it seemed almost forced, like she was trying to maintain some level of authority despite the situation unfolding around her. The principal didn't waste time. "Ms. Lawson," he began, his voice firm. "What happened with my son today? Why is there super glue in his hair?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the boy, then back at the principal. I don't know what you're talking about, sir," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't do anything to him." The counselor stepped forward. "I was in the classroom this morning. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Ms. Lawson was simply doing her job." The principal didn't take his eyes off Ms. Lawson. "You're telling me that you didn't pour glue in his hair?" She faltered, her face flushed with a mix of irritation and discomfort. I didn't do it intentionally. There was a small incident in class, and I just thought." She stopped herself, her words hanging in the air, but she seemed to realize that the story wasn't coming together in the way she hoped. The counselor looked at her, confusion apparent in her eyes. "What do you mean, thought? Ms. Lawson, if you did something to him, you need to be honest. This is not a situation we can sweep under the rug." The tension in the room grew thicker, and the boy, standing just outside the doorway, felt the weight of every second passing. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the words didn't make sense. He wanted to speak up, but his throat was tight, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Ms. Lawson continued, but her tone now seemed less certain. "I thought it would help him learn something, to correct his behavior." The principal's gaze hardened, and he took a deep breath. "What behavior are you talking about, Ms. Lawson? My son has been nothing but respectful to you. What could possibly justify what you've done to him?" Ms. Lawson swallowed hard, the facade of confidence she had been trying to maintain cracking. He wasn't paying attention in class. He wasn't following the instructions I gave." The principal stared at her for a long moment, taking in her words. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together a story that didn't quite add up. Why would she do this? Was there something more behind her actions that she wasn't telling them? And what did she mean by help him learn something? Before he could say anything more, there was a knock on the door, interrupting the tense silence. Another staff member had arrived, a senior teacher who had been informed of the situation. As she entered, her eyes immediately locked onto the boy's hair, and the expression on her face told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as the boy stood there, waiting for the storm to break, he realized that things were about to get much more complicated. This wasn't just about a teacher and a student anymore. It was about power, control, and what was going to happen when the truth came out. But for now, he could only wait. Would Ms. Lawson's story hold up? Would the principal's authority be enough to bring justice? Or would this situation spiral even further out of control? One thing was certain. The boy's world had been changed forever, and the consequences of that moment were just beginning to unfold. The room fell silent as the senior teacher stepped into the office. Her eyes immediately flicked to the boy, then to his hair, and she couldn't hide her disbelief. What happened here?" she asked, her voice trembling with shock. The principal glanced at her, then back at Ms. Lawson, his expression hardening. That's what I'd like to know. My son says you poured super glue in his hair. Is that true? Ms. Lawson, who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable, seemed to shrink under the weight of the principal's gaze. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was as if the situation was spiraling out of her control, and she had no way to stop it. The counselor stepped in, her voice calm but insistent. Ms. Lawson, this is a serious accusation. You need to tell us what happened. The teacher's face twisted with frustration. I didn't want to hurt him, she muttered, her eyes darting between the principal and the others in the room. I thought he needed a lesson. He wasn't listening. And a lesson. The principal interrupted, his voice rising. You thought gluing my son's hair would teach him a lesson. Do you even hear yourself right now? Ms. Lawson's eyes shifted uneasily as she tried to hold her ground, but the principal's anger was palpable. He was trying to stay composed, but every second stretched out the tension in the room. His son was standing outside, the weight of the entire situation on his shoulders, and there was nothing the principal could do to shield him from what was happening. The boy had trusted his teacher, and now his trust had been shattered in an instant. The senior teacher, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke. If what's being said is true, this could be a serious issue. The boy's father is the principal, and if this gets out, it could affect the entire school's reputation. We need to handle this delicately. She looked at Ms. Lawson, her gaze a mixture of concern and reproach. We can't let this slide. Ms. Lawson opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. The principal's mind was racing, and his chest tightened with every passing second. How had things gotten so out of hand? How had his son ended up in this situation? Before he could say anything more, the door opened once again, and the boy slowly stepped into the room, his eyes downcast. The principal's heart sank when he saw his son standing there, looking smaller than ever. The boy's eyes were red, and there was a visible tremble in his hands. It was as if he was trying to hold it together, but the weight of the situation was too much. Dad. The boy's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. The principal felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to reassure his son, to tell him that everything would be okay. But the words felt hollow in his mouth. His son had already been through so much, and now this was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything he had anticipated. The senior teacher turned to the boy, her face softening. We're trying to understand what happened, she said gently. Can you tell us exactly what Ms. Lawson did? The boy nodded, swallowing hard. She said I wasn't paying attention. I don't know. I was just trying to follow along. Then she came up to me, and before I knew it, she just poured it in my hair. His voice cracked, and his gaze remained fixed on the floor. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't deserve it. The principal felt his stomach twist with anger. He had always tried to raise his son to be respectful, to follow the rules, and yet here he was, his son, a victim of something that should never have happened. He had trusted the staff to care for the students, to protect them. And yet, in that moment, it felt as if that trust had been shattered. Ms. Lawson's face had paled, her hands trembling as she stood there, unable to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The principal took a step forward, his voice dangerously calm. I want you to explain to me why you thought this was acceptable, why you thought this was the right way to handle a student, my son in particular. She opened her mouth, but no coherent explanation came out. The words felt useless, as if they couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. And for the first time, the principal saw her for what she truly was, a person trapped in her own lies, trying desperately to cover up a mistake that she couldn't escape. The counselor, who had been silent for a while, cleared her throat. We need to decide what to do next, she said, her voice tight with tension. This isn't something we can ignore, and it's clear that something needs to be done to address what happened here. The principal didn't respond immediately. He looked at his son, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision before him. His son had always been strong, always tried to do the right thing. And yet here he was, standing in the midst of a situation that should never have existed. He needed to protect his son, but how? What was the right course of action? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned to Ms. Lawson. "I want you to leave. I will personally handle the rest of this from here on out. You don't belong here anymore." Her face went white, and she opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded and walked out of the office, her head low, her pride shattered. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and the silence that followed felt deafening. The senior teacher shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say next. The counselor looked at the principal, who was still staring at the closed door, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, the principal spoke, his voice low and controlled. "We need to figure out how to fix this. This is more than just a disciplinary issue. This is about trust, respect, and making sure this never happens again." He turned to his son, who was standing quietly, still processing everything that had just happened. "I'm going to take care of this, son," the principal said, his voice softening. "But I need you to be strong. We'll make sure no one else has to go through this. You hear me?" The boy nodded, but there was a shadow of uncertainty in his eyes. "What happens now, Dad? What happens to Miss Lawson?" The principal took a deep breath, his mind already racing ahead, calculating the consequences of what had just transpired. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be fallout. There would be repercussions. But for now, all he could do was hold on to his son, give him the reassurance he needed, and prepare for the storm that was about to break. Because as the clock ticked, and as the minutes turned into hours, it was becoming more and more apparent that the real battle had only just begun. And the truth, no matter how hard it was to face, would come crashing down in ways that no one in that room could have predicted. The minutes stretched into an hour as the principal sat in his office, trying to collect his thoughts. He had informed the school board of the incident, and an emergency meeting was being scheduled. His mind was occupied with the urgency of the situation, but something gnawed at him. Something didn't feel right. Why had Ms. Lawson acted so strangely? Why had she poured glue into his son's hair? Was it really just a misguided attempt to discipline a student? He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story. As much as he wanted to believe it was just a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment, his instincts told him otherwise. This wasn't just about a teacher being careless. Something was off, and the more he thought about it, the more questions arose. The door to his office creaked open, breaking his concentration. It was his son again, but this time, his face was different, pale, his expression filled with anxiety. "Dad," the boy said quietly, stepping into the room. "There's something I need to tell you." The principal looked up, sensing the change in his son's demeanor. The boy had always been honest, always direct, but now there was a hesitation in his voice that made the principal's heart skip a beat. "What is it, son?" The boy shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "I didn't want to say anything before, but when Ms. Lawson was talking to me in class, she said something. It was strange." The principal leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What did she say?" The boy paused, as if weighing whether or not to continue. "She said something about the way I looked. She said I looked just like him. She said I reminded her of someone." His voice trailed off, confusion and fear evident in his tone. "I didn't think much of it at first, but now that I'm thinking about it, it doesn't make sense. She looked at me like she was scared of me, like I was someone she didn't want to see." A chill ran down the principal's spine. The boy's words struck him like a slap to the face. Someone she didn't want to see. He echoed, his voice barely audible. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to shift, but he couldn't quite put them together yet. The boy nodded, his eyes darting nervously to the door, as if expecting someone to be listening. "I don't know what it means, Dad, but I think it's important. I think it has something to do with why she did this to me." The principal sat back in his chair, trying to process what his son had just said. The mention of someone she didn't want to see sent a wave of unease through him. Who could Ms. Lawson be referring to? And why would she look at his son with such fear? The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like something personal, a connection between his son and Ms. Lawson that no one had seen coming. Just as he was about to respond, the door swung open again, and this time it wasn't just the senior teacher or the counselor. It was a detective, a man in a dark suit, his face set with grim determination. The principal's heart sank at the sight of him. He had seen the man around the school a few times, but never for anything this serious. "Principal," the detective said, his voice cool and professional. "I need to speak with you about the incident involving your son and Miss Lawson." The principal stood up, his mind spinning. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice trained. "I've already spoken to the board. What more is there to discuss?" The detective's gaze flickered to the boy, then back at the principal. "It's not just an incident, sir. It's part of a larger investigation." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The principal felt the air leave his lungs, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "What do you mean?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The detective sighed, as though he had been dreading this conversation. "We've been investigating Ms. Lawson for a while now. She's involved in something much bigger than we thought. This whole situation with your son, it's just the tip of the iceberg." The principal's mind raced. His pulse quickened, and he felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. "What are you talking about? What does this have to do with my son?" The detective's eyes were steely. "We believe Ms. Lawson has been targeting certain students. Your son is just one of several she's singled out. And it's not just about discipline. There are other factors at play here, things that go much deeper than anyone realized." The principal's heart was pounding now, his thoughts spinning uncontrollably. "You're saying she's done this to other students. Why would she do something like that?" The detective leaned forward, his voice low. "We suspect she has been manipulating her position as a teacher to get close to certain students. There are rumors about her connections, her past. It's possible she's been involved in something illegal, and your son was the next in line. The glue, the behavior, this wasn't random. She's been targeting students for a reason." The weight of the detective's words hit the principal like a truck. His mind swirled with confusion, fear, and disbelief. The idea that Ms. Lawson, a trusted member of the staff, could have been manipulating students, using her position to hurt them. It didn't make sense. But the more the detective spoke, the more everything started to fall into place. The principal turned to his son, his mind still reeling. Did she ever mention anything else? Any names, any clues, anything that could help us understand what's really going on? The boy's face was pale, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No, Dad. She just kept saying I reminded her of someone. But it didn't make sense. I thought maybe she was just being weird. But now I don't know." The detective's eyes narrowed. "There's one more thing. We think she might be connected to a larger network. We've uncovered some ties between her and individuals involved in a criminal operation. We don't know the full extent of it yet, but your son may be in more danger than we realized." The principal felt his world begin to crumble around him. This wasn't just a case of a teacher losing control. It was something far more sinister, something that could change everything. His son had been caught in the crossfire of something dark and dangerous. And now, there was no going back. The detective turned to leave, his steps heavy with the weight of the news he had just dropped. "We're going to need your cooperation in this, Principal. We'll be in touch. But for now, you need to be careful. This is bigger than we thought." The door closed softly behind the detective, leaving the principal alone with his son. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of the truth that had just been revealed. The principal stood frozen, his mind reeling. How had he not seen this coming? How had this woman, this teacher, managed to hide her true intentions for so long? And most importantly, What would happen next? The investigation had just begun, and every answer seemed to lead to more questions. His son's life, and the safety of everyone at the school, was on the line. The principal barely slept that night. His mind raced with every piece of information he'd received. Ms. Lawson's involvement in something bigger, the detective's cryptic warnings, and his son's unsettling experience had all collided into a whirlwind of uncertainty. He'd spent hours reviewing her file, searching for any sign of misconduct. He even reached out to other schools she had worked at before, but there was no smoking gun, no obvious clues, just the quiet, unsettling suspicion that something more was hidden beneath the surface. The next morning, the principal was sitting at his desk when the phone rang. He picked it up quickly, knowing who it was before the voice on the other end spoke. "Principal, it's Detective Harris. You need to get to the school right now." His pulse quickened. "What's happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've got her," Harris said. "Ms. Lawson is in custody. We found everything we need. But there's something else, something you need to know." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The principal's stomach tightened as he prepared himself for what was coming next. "What is it? What else is there?" "We just uncovered something that ties her to a much larger operation than we initially thought. It's bigger than just her. There's someone else, someone you know well, who's been working with her all along." The principal's mind went blank for a moment. "What are you talking about?" "We think it's someone within the school," the detective said, his voice tight with urgency. "Someone close to you, someone you've trusted for years." The principal's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "Don't make any sudden moves," Harris warned. "We're still confirming everything, but it looks like it's your vice principal." The words hit him like a freight train. His vice principal, the man he had worked alongside for years, the one who had been with him through thick and thin, the one he trusted with the school's day-to-day operations. It was unthinkable. But as the detective spoke, everything started to fall into place. He couldn't even process the betrayal, the shock of it. He had seen his vice principal as a friend, as someone who shared his vision for the school. To think that he had been involved in something so dark, something so dangerous, it was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything he could imagine. The principal hung up the phone, his hands trembling. He had to act quickly. He couldn't afford to waste time. His son was already shaken by the events of the past few days, and now, with this revelation, the danger had escalated. He had to protect his son, protect the students, and make sure that the threat was neutralized. He stormed out of his office, his mind spinning. He found the vice principal in his office, going over some paperwork. The man looked up, a smile on his face, as though nothing had changed. "Good morning, Principal," the vice principal said, his voice casual. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. It was an empty, practiced expression, one that the principal had seen too many times before. "Sit down," the principal said, his voice steady but hard. "We need to talk." The vice principal's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. "About what?" "I know what you've been involved in," the principal said, the words coming out with a mix of disbelief and fury. "I know everything." For a moment, there was silence. The vice principal didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he looked almost resigned. It was as if he had been expecting this confrontation for some time. Finally, after a long pause, he leaned back in his chair, his face hardening. "I should have known it would come to this," he said, his tone cold. "I thought I could control the situation. But you always had to be the hero, didn't you?"